Good afternoon, class. We are going to look further into resettlement and into settlement and the settlement patterns, and we're also going to look at how sites and situations affect the selection of a settlement. So, as I mentioned earlier on, that is yesterday, I mentioned that for you to take part in our assessment at the end of this lesson, you have to log in into Hello Smart, which is here. It's highlighted in green. Hello Smart. Right, hellosmart.com. So just type www.hellosmart.com and remember you have to have the data. So you sign up as a guest. The ID number is 598751. So you also add your name after you have done that so that we know who is giving the responses. Go on to show us how smart you are. Let's now delve into the lesson. But before we do this lesson, I want to just inform you that these lessons are proudly sponsored by VT Africa, and we are presenting them using the smart technology. So our topic today, as I mentioned earlier on, is rural and urban settlement. So let's first look at the rural settlements. But before we go to the rural settlements, we need to know what vocabulary are we using. Among our terms here that we're going to be looking at, we've got new terms such as alluvium, arable farming, dry point site, wet point site, and we're going to be defining those vocabularies as we are going through our lesson. Table of contents is here. We are looking at how site and situation affect the location of rural settlements. We're also looking at the classification of rural settlements. Just a moment. My board has taken me to the wrong page here. So classification of rural settlements according to pattern and function, reasons for different shapes of settlements, round, linear. Let me just use this to aid us understand what we are doing. So we are talking of site and situation and how they affect the rural settlement. And then we are also looking at the reasons why there are different patterns and what are the functions. Then we're also looking at different shapes of settlements. We have got settlements that are round, we have linear, T-shaped, and we have got crossroad. So these are the types or the shapes of settlements that we are going to be looking at, and they are in illustrations, and we're going to all see clearly what we mean by those terms. Let's look at rural settlements. How site and situation affect the location of rural settlements. Site, it is the actual land where the settlement is. And it is determined by specific factors forming the reasons why the site was chosen. So we know that in rural areas, usually the function is unifunction. And we know that it's usually primary activities that are happening there. So people choose the settlement to be where they can get the essential resources that can sustain their lives. So usually people will want to settle where they can do their farming, they can do forestry, they can do fishing, or they can do mining. So it is very important that where people decide to settle, the life providing resource must be there. And this life resource, providing resource that we were talking about since yesterday is water. So water has to be there and people settle where there is water. So in the instance where settlements focus on mining, more established service start taking part. So, and the place will not remain rural for long. We can get an example of cities like Johannesburg that sprouted out because of gold mining around Johannesburg. We can take also the city of Kimberley, which is the provincial capital for Northern Cape. How it sprouted out, it was because there was a discovery of diamonds. And there was a rush to that place until other services started forming, and then it became a city. So we have got definitions here that we have underneath, as I was telling you yesterday, that you always have to take note of these definitions at the base of our slides. Rural settlement, these are settlements that are focusing on primary activities with a smaller population countrywide, in the countryside, sorry. Primary activity, this is the making direct use of natural resources or raw materials. Next slide. Rural settlements, how site and situation affect the location of rural settlements. Both site and situation. So these aspects are equally important. Both site and situation present factors that affect the location of rural settlements and whether people would decide to settle there. So factors that influence the location of settlements. So it is not by coincidence that we put water is our at the top of all the essential resources that are needed, or the factors that are needed for a location or a settlement to be established. So water is a life-sustaining resource, and it is very critical that there should be access to water before people decide to have a settlement. Then we do have relief. This relief, we are talking about the gradient, we are talking about the steepness of the surface, the earth's surface. It is very important because it will determine if it's a farming community, it will determine the rate of erosion, it will also determine the runoff, how much water seepage, what we call seepage, is going to be collected in the ground for crop production. Then aspect, we talked about it yesterday. We talked about aspect as where the landscape is facing. So, for instance, areas or land that is facing to the north on the southern hemisphere is known to be warmer than those that are facing to the south, that is in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, the lands that are facing to the south are warmer than those that are facing to the north. And the reason there is that because the sun usually is around the equator. So the equator is the hottest region because the sun is above the equator most of the time. So if you are on the northern hemisphere, it means the landscape has to be facing the southern side, and on the southern hemisphere, it has to be facing the northern hemisphere, which is the direction of the equator. So the soil also is very important. The types of soil, some soils sustain crop production, some soils do not support that, and some soils also are rich in nutrients, and those who are doing their mining will want to settle there. Then we have the climate. The climate is also very important in that some climates are dry, some have got harsh weather, where it will be very difficult to live, and people have to choose wisely where they want to stay. The resources, you may talk of resources that people are sustaining their lives on. You may talk of resources like wood, that is, will provide timber for building their homes. You may talk of energy. People need those resources for day-to-day survival. Then accessibility. This is the way a place can be reached by different means of transport. Then we need to further look at the factors, and then we describe. So we are going to the major factor here, water. It is a basic need and a life-sustaining resource, making it vital to a rural settlement, and therefore people will settle near rivers. So we are saying it is basic need. You cannot do without water. Primary activities like farming need water for irrigation and drinking water for livestock. Where water is scarce, people will settle in a nucleated pattern. So we defined these terms yesterday. We are still emphasizing on them here so that you actually get the definitions and do not have doubted or mistaken descriptions of those terms or definitions. So we have nucleated pattern around a wet point. Where water is abundant, like flood-prone or marshy areas, people will settle further away from the line in a dispersed pattern known as dry point site. So we do have our definitions here. I'm not going to touch on them now. You can take a screenshot and you view, or you can view this video when it's on YouTube. Rural settlements, another factor is relief. And people settle on flat open land next to a river crossing because it's better for agriculture, accessibility and building. Rural settlements are likely to develop on plateaus. I was mentioning this word yesterday. This is an area on the surface of the land which is generally flat. So people are likely to settle on those plateaus because of those effects, like the rain will have more seepage into the ground and there will be less runoff. So that will mean the nutrients will be retained in the ground and there will be enough moisture for the crop production, for crop growth. People will choose to settle on land sheltered by a mountain or hilltop if defense is important. We may give an example of how Lesotho became a kingdom there in the mountains, in the Maluti Mountains, because there was a need for defense. Rural settlements, how site affects the location of rural settlements. Let's look at aspect. Settlements are more likely to develop on warmer slopes when the people are interested in farming and forestry. Let me just emphasize on what I was explaining. In the southern hemisphere, north-facing slopes are warmer, and in the northern hemisphere, the south-facing slopes are warmer. Then let's look at soil. We all know how important soil is. We build our homes on the land, which is on the soil. We do a crop production on the soil. We do mining in the soil. So the land is very important. So this type of soil that is in the area is largely also a determining factor on where to settle and why people should settle there. So there are very different types of soil, but at the moment we want to look at this favorite soil that people actually settle on, like the alluvium floodplains. They are needed for crops because they have got nutrients and there is water. They are found on the riverbeds. So you need to have deep, well-drained soil, which is deposited, that is on the edges of the river. And the silt is washed down by flooding rivers, which helps to support grazing and agriculture. So if you, for some of you here who are doing history, you could have at one moment in your studies studied about the Egyptian civilization. You will realize how the Nile River actually contributed to settlements being established along the Nile River because of the alluvial soils. Climate. In South Africa, rural settlements prefer the warmer north-facing slopes because they get a lot of sun and are away from the frost-prone valley floor. So this is for the obvious reason that people want to grow their crops, and they prefer to stay on north-facing slopes. Therefore, settlements are less likely to develop in areas with extreme weather conditions. Farming and forestry communities prefer areas where the climate is better suited to the needs of their crops and animals. Colleagues, you realize that most of these things we are doing here is actually capping on what we did yesterday, and this is to consolidate the knowledge that you have and even add more concepts as we go along, so that you are thoroughly prepared for your examinations at the end of the year. Resources are also important. The availability of resources can determine the location of rural settlements. Settlements will develop close to resources needed for their primary examples. Then we do have examples here. The examples are that fertile soil is needed for farming and forestry. Then we have this other type of soil, pastoral soil, is needed for grazing. Pastoral soil, it is the soil that promotes the growth of natural grass. So the grass for feeding the animals and for livestock in general. So we also need mineral-rich rock structures for mining. Wood is needed for timber, building, and for fuel. You know that in rural areas, some people are using firewood for cooking. Accessibility. This is how people can get to their settlement using different means of transport. This cannot be overemphasized. Rural settlements need access to other settlements as well, and urban settlements to sell goods and receive specialized services. Farmsteads are usually isolated, but situated close to a road to minimize the distance to the nearest market or urban settlement. Roads or other forms of transport connecting them need to be close by. So this is also very important because some of the produces that are produced in these rural areas are perishable, and they need to be taken as quickly as possible after harvesting to the market. Otherwise, they will deteriorate and they will get rotten and go bad. The rural settlements, how situation affects the location of rural settlements. The situation of a settlement can be favorable or unfavorable. When it is favorable, we are talking of interaction of other factors like transport, trade. We have transport, we have trade. Let me make it smaller. We've got climate, defense, which encourages the development and expansion of the settlement. When it's unfavorable, there are negative factors. We have limited transport. We have trade and resources, or poor climate, and all these will limit or stop the development or expansion of a settlement. Let's look at this classification of rural settlements according to pattern. Rural settlements are classified according to pattern as we discussed yesterday. We talked about the dispersed and the nucleated. So we are now going to look at the dispersed pattern and see what is actually meant by dispersed pattern. When the pattern is dispersed, the farmsteads are arranged far away from one another. And then the example is isolated farmsteads with one farmhouse, its outbuildings and surrounding fields. So this is a dispersed pattern like in a farming community. Rural settlements are classified according to two settlement patterns. We've got a nucleated pattern. Then we have got farmsteads, which are arranged close to one another in clusters. So its settlements are classified according to two settlement patterns, which is the nucleated pattern, and the examples are hamlets and villages. So the other pattern is the dispersed pattern. That's also another pattern that classifies the rural settlement. So we've got nucleated and dispersed. Right, here are the two patterns that classify settlements, rural settlements in particular, dispersed pattern and nucleated pattern. In the dispersed pattern, we've got the factor that actually determines the establishment of that settlement is that there is water, and usually there is a dry point site that allows farms to spread out. So the dry point site, it is where you have got the water, and then the dry point site is the region that is far away enough not to cause the flooding of the settlement, and people will settle there around a water source. And usually this happens in areas where there are swamps. You can talk of Okavango, Delta. You can talk of other desert regions where there will be oases, and then people build around those oases. So, and the relief, a large farmstead can be built on a flat land. Then aspect, mountainous or hilly land is scattered patches of land and can only accommodate one farm. Then we've got the types of soil as well. In fertile land means a large farm is needed to ensure a large yield. So if the soil is sandy and the yield is low, it means the farm has to be large. If the soil is rich, a small farm can produce a lot of yield in that farm. Then resources, individual farms are possible because the resources are available at more than one site in a specific area. Let's look at nucleated. Nucleated water, it's a wet point site forces farms to cluster together. So the availability of water might actually force the homes to be clustered together instead of being built around the area. So this is usually a small, like a water source that will actually make people build their homes close to each other. And the relief, many farms can be built on flat land. Aspect, mountainous or hilly land forces people together on small pieces of land. Then soil, fertile land means many farms can be supported. And resources, limited resources are available, which means farmers have to share communal, agricultural, or pastoral land. We're still continuing with classification of rural settlements according to pattern, and we are continuing with, now we are looking at advantages. What are the advantages of dispersed farming pattern, and what are advantages of nucleated farming pattern? The advantage of the dispersed farming pattern is that there is privacy on decision making, because they are far from each other. On decision making because they're far from everyone, so they have to make their own decisions. Then no shared profits, introduction of mechanization and soil conservation methods. Then advantages for nucleated is that there is interaction with people. There is sharing of ideas and problem solving. We have got, then farmers can also assist one another. There is less capital needed and the cost of machinery and tools can be shared. This can be true in communities where people are having cooperatives and such things. Let's look at disadvantages. The dispersed farming pattern has got a disadvantage of a lack of social contact and interaction. No one can share ideas with the problems. No community can assist in time of need. High capital is needed to keep the farm running. And then on the nucleated farming, you have disadvantages of minimal privacy. All farmers must agree on decisions made. Fragments or small properties Don't allow mechanization. Everyone is affected by soil erosion because it will extend across the farms. This is particularly a challenge in most rural areas in South Africa, where there is a lot of erosion happening throughout the whole land because there is a lot of people on the same pieces of land, and people are sharing the same land and tilling the same land over and over again. So individuals have less scope for initiative. Machinery or tools sometimes unavailable. We are still continuing with the lesson on classification of rural settlements. Every settlement is unique and has a different or specific function. The diversity in functions allows every settlement to contribute to a larger community. The functions of rural settlements are related to the services that are provided to their residents and visitors. Diversity, what is diversity? It is a range of different things. So when we talk of diversity, we are saying there are a lot of things that are being done in the same society. Right, we need to look at this game here and just have some fun. We need to have fun while learning. That is how kids learn, after all. We learn through play. So let's look at this game here on this smart lab. There it is. We've got some music there. This is a fill-in. So you can play this game. So on your gadgets there, you can play this game. So here you need to fill in and drag and drop the words where they are supposed to be. Like for instance, it says settlement functions and settlements are. What are settlement functions? Let's try with one word here. Mineral. Is it accepted? Settlement functions is mineral and what? Let's see if this one is going to. It's accepted. Then it says settlements are recreation, centralized, market, transport, agricultural. What are settlements? Are they centralized? Surrounding settlements? So when it is accepted there, it means and then you say settlement, mine, dash resources. And then you will be putting in the words according to where recreation settlements provide for tourism. Check the answers. We've been putting them now. We want to check if our answers are correct. Ooh, what has happened here? It means we only got how many? We got 2 out of the whole. So we can actually redo this activity. We go back and we say settlement functions. What are the settlement functions? Then we go on and do this game until we get everything correct. The advantage of this is that you check your answers on your own and you can go on. Thank you for having fun in this activity. Let's move on to another slide and so we are looking now at settlements, classification of settlements according to their function. This is the classification. It's actually based on, it's actually what was supposed to be done in that activity that we did. So this is now an explanation. Function, market and agricultural. Settlement classification. It is a centralized settlement where surrounding farming settlements are provided the opportunity to sell or distribute their own goods and buy or obtain other goods, products and services. Then transport is a settlement developed at a point with many transport routes. Mining, a settlement that developed as a result of the discovery of mineral resources are still being mined. Recreation, a settlement that developed and established itself as a tourism town. This town started out as a rural settlement, but is no longer classified as one since it now provides secondary services. So this is according to the function. So the functions that we have are market and agricultural. We've got transport, we've got mining, and we've got recreation. Right. We once talked about the shapes of the settlements. So we said rural settlements have got 4 basic shapes which are developed according to their site. So the site determines the shape of the settlement. We've got round, usually it's around a water source. Then we have got linear, usually it's around a route or it is around, following a river. T-shaped, this also is usually around the routes to the market, the roads. Crossroad, as it is actually self-explanatory, crossroad, where the roads cross to the major markets. So people usually want to settle there. Let's look at the next slide, which rural settlements, reasons for different shapes of settlements. They usually develop around a central area, radiating outwards. A church, there may be a church in the center, or it may be a water source, but it's going to be a church at the center, a village, a lake or park is usually situated at its center. This pattern can serve as defense of the inhabitants. The tribal area forms a round shape when surrounded by the villagers' dwellings. So that is the round. Let's look at the linear. Develops along a road, transport route, river, lake, the foot of a mountain, or along the coast. This allows the community easy access to transport routes as well as water. It usually forms a long, narrow pattern which can be maintained even when the population grows. So let's look at these points and try to highlight them. It develops along road, transport route, river, lake, foot of a mountain, or along the coast. And what does it do? It gives access to transport as well as water. The T-shaped develops at a meeting of 2 roads or a T-junction. In other words, intersection 3 roads. Farmsteads and their outbuildings are built along these roads on all sides, allowing easy access to transport routes. Crossroad, this develops where 2 roads intersect. In other words, an intersection of 4 roads. Settlement develop at the crossing of the 2 roads. This is an important point for rural settlements as it provides access to transport routes to trade goods. Then we want to look at land use in the rural settlements. We mentioned this earlier on when we looked at the functions. So land use is actually according to those functions. It is for farming and forestry, economic activities, ecotourism, hunting, and fishing. So the farming is further divided into 2 categories, which is subsistence farming and commercial farming. And when we talk of subsistence farming, we're talking of farmers who are farming to sustain their own livelihoods. They are farming for their own consumption and not for reselling, not for selling. Whereas commercial farming, people are practicing that function. They are farming in order to sell to the markets. So the commercial farming is now also further divided into two. We've got what we call the intensive commercial farming, and we have got what we call the extensive commercial farming. So you'll find that the other, when it is extensive, you are actually having a mechanized farming, whereas intensive farming usually it's where people are not using much mechanization. Agriculture is the main land use in rural settlements. Types of farming, we've got what is called arable farming, where people are plowing the soil to grow crops. Then we've got pastoral farming, which is a form of agriculture aimed at producing livestock like cattle, pigs, piggeries, and what have you. Then you have got mixed farming, where people mix arable farming and pastoral farming. They are growing crops and they are also raising livestock. Then we have got orchards and vineyards. These are fruit trees, and then the vineyards, you know, the grapes. So growing trees, fruit trees and grapes. Then plantation farming. This is a form of agriculture aimed at growing trees like the pine trees, the oak trees that are being used for construction purposes. Right, let's look further into subsistence farming and commercial farming and differentiate those two. Subsistence farming, it is farming to provide food for the farmer's household. So this is what I meant by saying for sustaining their livelihoods or for their own consumption. The aim is not to sell the goods, but to consume them. Then commercial farming, farming with the aim to sell the goods at markets and to generate an income. Forms of commercial farming are stock farming, farming breeding with animals, crop farming, cultivating crops, farming a combination of stock and crop farming, commercial farming to be intensive or extensive. So these two are just concise definitions of the two forms of commercial farming, which is intensive farming. A small area of land is farmed with high input capital labor and produce high yield, whereas extensive is a large area of land is farmed with less input to produce a low yield. So this is where the soil will be poor, and usually this is where the soil will be rich. Then rural settlements, land use in rural settlements. We have two land uses there. Economic activities. Most rural areas practice primary economic, farming, forestry, fishing, hunting, mining. When rural settlements become involved in tourism as a way to increase their income, they are no longer classified as rural settlement, but as tourism is a secondary activity. Ecotourism, many rural farmers convert their farms into tourist attractions, which will provide bigger income. Game farms fall under ecotourism and are used for hunting and breeding rare game. Some farms convert their farms into trout farms where tourists can fish. Learners, we now want to go to our formative assessment because our time is almost up. So let's look at this question here and try and answer this question. Just scribble there on a piece of paper. Aspect is a site factor that affects the location of rural settlements. Why? Then we have our options there in multiple choice. It's a vital, life-sustaining resource to a settlement. People will settle further away from the flat line. Farming settlements are more likely to develop where there is fertile soil. Farming settlements are more likely to develop on warmer slopes. So we are talking of aspect. So this is where the definition of those terms, the vocabulary that I alluded to at the beginning comes in. You need to know those definitions. You do not have to cram them, but you just have to know them. So what is the answer as you attempt those answers? Let us now, I think everyone has attempted the answer, and then you check if you are right on the answer. We're going to draw our So our correct answer there is D, because aspect actually refers to what? To where the land surface is facing, as we defined at the beginning of the slides. Then thank you very much for being our guests today. So tomorrow we are going to have another lesson at 10 o'clock sharp. So make sure you tune in at 10 o'clock and have another geography lesson. We'll be continuing with settlements. Thank you very much.